many homes that were made during the 1800s, during that time. They just saw ghosts clinging to them, being like, hey, listen, I'm dead. Figure me out. And then you just realize at the end of the day, they're still gone. Hello, guys. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Miracle Population Me, and this is our monthly book club episode. Can you believe it's actually still February when I'm making this video? It might be posted in March 1st, I'm not gonna lie. But anyway, welcome back to the monthly book episode where I talk about a book that I keep in my apartment for literal years and then decide to read it and share with you guys so you can make a decision on whether or not you want to read it or skip it in future reads. So this month's book that I read, I've actually shown it in a few videos already. It's called Summer Suns. It is by Lee Mandello, and it is basically a horror thriller book, which is, I think it's a new series of books for me. I don't think I've read a horror book in like literal years. So reading this book has been kind of a twist in the turn and a bit of a longer read than it should be, but let's get into it. As per usual, I will give my summary and then give my opinion and give the rating at the very end so you know if it's a good book according to me or if it's bad. And yes, this is not spoiler free, so if you do want to read the book at any point of time, wait till my opinion, I guess. I don't know. You guys will see at the bottom where the opinion starts and where it ends and how the summary works, okay? But anyway, let's get into it. So Summer Suns is about two guys named Andrew and Eddie who grew up together. Eddie was actually an orphan from his family, and then he was adopted into Andrew's family when he was really young, and he came into really some old money. I assume they're from the South, so old money is like old money, like from like the 1800s old. So he became really rich, and he got that money, and then he like used it for Andrew's family as well. And then he went off to school in the summertime to college, Vanderbilt. And during that time, he was gone for like 6 months, and Andrew was meant to follow him, but because he was best friends with Eddie, Eddie kept telling him, "I'll let you know when I come over. I'm getting a place set up," because he owned a house over there. Because he's rich, right? He's rich. But 6 months after he goes to Vanderbilt, he is presumed dead. And it was unfortunately a suicide. And it caused a lot of problems within the family because no one really suspected that of Eddie. And the most person that didn't suspect it is Andrew because he never thought of him to be really depressed or really have any symptoms that showed that he was going to do that. But at the same time, he had no idea what he was doing in Vanderbilt that made him think that way. So a few months after his funeral, he goes over to Vanderbilt. He moves into the new house, meets new people, meet the cousins Riley and Sam, who one of them lives with Eddie at the time. Another person is the cousin, so he's more of a speed racer, drug dealer, mechanic, all in one. Yep, very interesting person. And essentially, Andrew comes into this new life of meeting new people that Eddie has never told him about because at one point they shared everything. Like they're like this, but like really like that. Like I think you kind of learn a little bit later in the end that they were kind of closer to being lovers than they were to being brothers because they've just been through so much together. And I'll get more into like how that kind of fits into the storyline. But essentially, Andrew goes into Vanderbilt. He doesn't go to class because he's not really there for the school. He's there to figure out what happened in the 6 months that Eddie was there that led him to cause a horrible thing to himself. And by doing so, he talks to so many people. He talks to his school advisor, Jane Thrott, one of the mentees or mentors that he had at the school, West. And he talks to several people at the parties who were able to give him more information about old spooky stories that were going on in the South around that time. And now we get into the spooky story part of this conversation. Growing up, Eddie and Andrew have been a bit different than other people, I would say. They were in a bad accident years when they were kids, when they were lost in a cave for several weeks. And it became major headlines because it was a really big search for them. They couldn't be found for weeks. And then when they got found, it was like, wow, these kids are alive. Like you probably should have died because they had immense amount of bruises and wounds on their body that was correlating with like a corpse if they were to be found dead. So they're very lucky to be alive, but no one truly knew what happened to them in that cave. Well, essentially, they fell in because some weird spirit, I would say, has forced them into the hole and has left them there for several weeks, forced them to reconcile with the fact that there are hauntings in their home and in their neighborhood and in their southern side of town. And that has forced them to come into recognition with seeing the dead, but not seeing the dead like you would think like psychics do or necromancers, I guess, do, but more of like understanding the old curses and spirits that come with your generational family tree, or even more voodoo type magic if you're more knowledgeable about that. But they really kept that to themselves because they're the only ones who can see it, feel it, and not really understand it. But in some ways, it is haunting them every time they move somewhere. Which is why when Eddie goes to go to Vanderbilt, Andrew is really ready to leave his hometown and go with him, because the hauntings that he felt as a kid through that cave, it stayed with him throughout the entire time. And the only person he had to share it with was Eddie. So when he was found, unfortunately deceased, it became more apparent that whatever Eddie was going through in Vanderbilt led to his death, because he wasn't the kind of person to let that stop him. Because out of two of them, Eddie took better to the hauntings they were dealing with than Andrew ever did, who went to Eddie for more support. Because I'm not gonna lie, being haunted sounds real scary. Sounds real scary. And essentially, when he follows Eddie's footsteps, he starts to realize that Eddie was actually doing a little bit more about the spooky stuff than he told Andrew. They made a pact when they were younger after the whole cave thing that they were not going to do the scary thing, because it actually spooked Andrew a lot more, as I said before. And Eddie decided to ignore that. He ignored that completely. He actually decided to go out and do American Studies as his major, and not only that, look into the folklore of town, understand more about the curses and stories and scary stuff that goes on, because they're in, like, I think Vanderbilt was in Nashville, so they're pretty deep in the South, and there are many forests, many woods, like many homes that were made during the 1800s, during that time. And just having that always there is like, oh, this is a perfect place for a haunting house, basically. And he was interviewing many people as well, just to know more about their family secrets, any stories they knew, any hauntings that they grew up with their grandmother or parents that came up with stories in their childhood, because he wanted to know and understand more about the haunting that was connected to him and Andrew, and why it was sticking with him. So it's a long story, more or less, because Andrew takes a long time to actually want to do any of the work that Eddie left off, because he does not want to deal with the spooky stuff. He wants to leave it behind because it is not a haunting like a normal haunting. It's not a ghost clinging to them being like, hey, listen, I'm dead. Figure me out. It's more of like something that's just in the air. Like, you can kind of just see dead people and then they just cling to you, and you're just like, I'm not trying to deal with that today. I'm going to keep going. But unfortunately, after Eddie had passed away, more or less of his ghost cling to Andrew. I say more or less because it's considered irreverent, which is, I don't want to say a haunting of a ghost, which is kind of funny, but it's like an empty corpse of who Eddie used to be. It was sticking to Andrew, like it was clinging on to him. He would literally ignore it because he didn't want to deal with whatever the reverend was dealing with him. It will literally tell him to go follow something, and he will be like, no. And it's not Scooby Doo. It's not follow this trap and then get to the real tea. It's more like, oh yeah, you should listen to me, follow me, and then go to this dead deer's corpse so that we can figure out if this connects to how I died. And it was like, yeah, we're not going to do that today. How about we leave me alone for the night? And unfortunately, that he kept ignoring it for a majority of the story. So I wouldn't say it's stagnant for a very long time, but because of how descriptive they would be with the Reverend in terms of how it was affecting Andrew's life, especially living with one of the cousins, Riley, who can see psychic. He's kind of a psychic, so you can see the Reverend that clings on to Andrew without having it connect to him as well. So he knows that Andrew is essentially one of them, and can basically, he wants him to pick up a damn book and figure out what's going on with himself, because now that he's living with Riley, it becomes a really big issue for the both of them, and they were both friends to Eddie. But later on in the story, he talks to people like West, who is his mentor, who had it out for Eddie, not because Eddie may have had something out for him, but because he was a legacy kid coming into a really good school, and also talking about folklore and curses and like other stuff. And the advisor, Jane Throd, she legit was into that stuff. Like, her house is a plantation home. I'm not gonna cap. That's why I said 1800s. If you couldn't clock it, her house was a plantation home, and she knew all about the curses and the folklore and all that jazz, right? So she was very intrigued into what Eddie was talking about. And Wes was an African American kid from Mississippi or Missouri, whoopsies. And so he has his own stories that he wants to do for his PhD, and having his literal advisor not want to help him was causing him to have rife with Eddie before he died. He didn't have anything to do with his death, but it does come off kind of suspicious, and almost everyone in that town was considered a suspect. So then we moved the story a bit longer, and then at this point, Andrew is actually wanting to like figure out what is going on, right? Because it's not getting better. He's been in this like town, not school. He has not been in school. He's been skipping, but he's been in this town for like several months now and has chosen to not take up any classes, but also not look into what caused Eddie to die. Because throughout this whole time, they don't know where his phone is. They have barely any notebooks that he made during the time he was there. And the people he talked to, they all say that he was looking into spooky stuff. So essentially, he goes into asking help from Riley and Sam, who were able to not only dig up old books that Eddie was working on within the school, but also talk to people that he talked to in the past. One of them being this couple, the McCormicks, who essentially had their own spooky story that they called the Fulton case. Eddie's original last name was Fulton before his parents died, and the case, or I would say the curse, the Fulton curse, it basically goes very similar to one really, really, really old ancestor of theirs was to marry this girl from another town, but she got really sick and he didn't want her to die. So he went to the lands of which they believe in weird spirits, right? And offer up his sister as sacrifice so that he might save his wife. And so he killed his sister. The grounds basically took the body and then said, "Okay, go save your wife," right? But because it's a curse that he claimed onto and not some other religious symbol, it took a lot more than just his sister. It took part of his sanity. It took his wife's sanity. She got better, but they had to be locked away because of how crazy they were. And so even after they passed away from old age, their family, their kids, their descendants from that point in time would die in like horrific ways, pretty young at the same time. So then all that combined with the fact that Eddie died pretty young too, it almost seemed like the curse got to him. And from their story, Andrew was able to piece together that maybe the curse is real. Maybe the curse is what is clinging on to him and Eddie, because he's not. So Andrew is not related to Eddie in any sort of way. But after the cave situation when they were younger, they kind of shared more of a deeper bond from whatever was almost going to kill them back then. So maybe he's like more connected because of that, and that's what the book kind of insinuates, that he's not a relative. He is most definitely bonded to him thicker than blood in this case. And so in doing so, he's able to go to talk to Jane Thrall, who's their advisor, because they assume that she has more information about what was going on in Eddie's final moments before he presumably killed himself, which, by the way, Andrew does not believe that. He doesn't believe Eddie killed himself, if I did make that clear. He did not believe he killed himself. So when he goes to Thrall, he goes with Sam and hoping that she'll be able to enlighten some information about what was going on and what he researched and what made him switch up his research from regular folklore to thinking more about his own family tree and how this curse was affecting him and how to take it off, preferably take it off. And he walked into a trap pretty easily. He actually walked into a trap really easily. It was actually kind of crazy how quickly the trap was laid out, and then he just like walked into it, because apparently Jane Thrall had everything to do with the death of Eddie, and she kind of kept it a secret because obviously she had her own narrative that she was trying to spin from her. So originally they thought Jane was supposedly taking research from people like Eddie and even at one point Wes, because she was just wanting to get tenure in her school, plagiarize. She's been able to plagiarize, and she was originally just there to plagiarize people's stories so that she can get tenure in her school for academic research. But when they got to her place, they realized there was a bigger thing going on. So her husband Mark has cancer and is dying. RIP him. And so she's been trying to find a way to like extend his life period. And because she also knew of the Fulton curse, and her family goes down deep into the South, she actually was very much trying to understand more about this curse and do it herself. But because it's usually considered fictional, she wasn't going to do it on her own accord until she met Eddie, who had literally the Fulton curse within him. And that's the reverend that I speak of when I talk about Andrew, except Andrew is more of the corpse of Eddie in terms of an actual curse, like a ghost or something. When Andrew and Sam basically go to her place, they are quick to fall into a trap that they have where she drugs them and drags them into some warehouse, ties them up, and looks at Andrew and says, "I want the reverend that's inside you, because that can potentially save my husband from dying of cancer." And we realize real quick that her motivation, which seems kind of in a different world dumb because like you're really gonna trust a random curse in your husband. She seems to think that if Andrew gives it up to her, then she'll be able to save her husband who's died of cancer. Which, of course, if you listen to the story I just told you about the Fulton curse, that's not how that works. That actually makes it worse. Like you survive, but you also lose a large part of yourself, and then your descendants all kind of die in a really horrific way. But she doesn't care about that. She cares about her husband, and that's it. And then we learn that she was the one who killed Eddie. She actually, it's a lot of trigger warnings in this one, I feel like, but she actually like cuts his wrists so that it loses more of his psychotic barrier, I want to say, allows the reverend to actually enter their body without any type of boundaries or resistance. And it actually controls the body of the person that they're hosting. In this case, it was Andrew. And so she's cutting his wrist so that he'll be able to hold in the reverend, which has been causing him a massive amount of trouble this entire time. And she wants him to give her the reverend once it connects to him. And she's holding Sam as a hostage in case he doesn't do that. But at this point, Sam is able to like fight back. He fights back against Mark, essentially killing him. Which I don't know why she put her husband there to help fight. I mean, he was sick, like really sick. I don't know why he was there, but yeah, he dies. Unfortunately, R.I.P. him. And by doing so, she goes over to him and try to kill him, and then he has reverence inside of him, which is not a great feeling. But because at this point he knows the full truth about what happens to Eddie, he no longer truly fears it and actually let it control him because he's losing blood, so he has no choice. But on top of that, he's also breaking free of his bounds because he's wrapped up in rope and stuff. And he I don't know how to explain this because it's kind of hard to understand what happened when he basically killed Jane, but he ate her soul. He ate her soul. So yeah, that happened. He ate her soul. I think that's like I'm sorry. I've read horror books in the past, but they've used different lingo, and I'm just like, what is a reverend? What is the eating of their being? What is like? I'm just over here like they need a definition or a dictionary in the back or glossary. But he eats her soul, and essentially that causes her to die without physically looking different than where she was when she was alive. And they essentially save each other, but Sam is horribly beaten up, and he's cut in the eye, and then Andrew is bleeding everywhere and also has a disgusting reverend inside him because it's not a ghost or paradise. It is a corpse body basically sitting in your soul. Okay. It's like, I don't know what a good example of this is. I don't know. Think of Swamp Thing and how he literally held his real corpse as an anchor to being Swamp Thing. It's similar to that, only the corpse isn't it's his best friend's Eddie. Um, and yeah, I mean, once they figure out what happened, it's like not better, I guess. It's kind of hard to tell because the story doesn't give off opinions. Essentially, what happened next is after they killed them, it was defense because you can't prove otherwise. It's not like they're going to be like, oh, yeah, you guys killed him in cold blood. It's like, no, I was tied up and stabbed like several times. So they got away with it because it was self defense. It came to light that she killed Eddie in the same fashion. So everyone who thought he died of his own accord were essentially wronged. But at the same time, it does come out in newspapers, media, because it's Vanderbilt, right? It's a huge school, very popular. And one of your most popular teachers just did this to one of their most popular students. So it becomes very known. But even throughout all this, Andrew has Eddie's reverend inside of him. And it's causing issues because in this time of this entire storyline, he's gotten closer to Sam and wants to be with him like that, like romantically. But he can't do that if Eddie is still within him because that's what caused all these issues to begin with. Not that it's Eddie's fault, right? He was also lured into this bullshit, but his dead corpse gotta go. So he takes up on Riley's offer, and they go to a haunted house that was an old plantation home that belonged to Jane. And they were originally gonna go there to like learn more about the curse and where it really came from and how it was affecting, Andrew. And he was going to potentially think about keeping it just because it was the last part of Eddie he really had that was connected to him, but there's no soul in that reverend. There is no soul. But they realized really quickly that the house was so haunted that the Reverend wanted to get stronger by being in the house and was willing to try and kill Andrew over it. So they ran out the house and they burned it to crisp. And then he was able to convince the Reverend to leave his body and go into the house. That way they can burn it all at once. And it was their way of essentially saying goodbye to Eddie because that was basically him in a really twisted way. It was him. It was him. That's very true. And he gets to be with Sam. Well, he doesn't get to be with Sam, but they're taking it slow. Yeah, I'm skipping a lot of stories because there's a lot of minor characters that I couldn't do without derailing the story immensely. But yeah, that's the entire summary. I hope you guys caught what I was talking about because I feel like I twisted it around. But that's the summary. Here's my opinion. The opinion is I think if this was made into a movie, which I know I usually check if it's a movie, but I didn't check this time because honestly I forgot. I think it would have been done really badly. And I say that because think of Stephen King book and how he knows how to make good horror books. Like that's the books I think of when I think of horror. I know it's other people too, but I watch his stuff too. And his movies are usually like decent to being terrible. But they're never like great films that you can watch and then rewatch, unless it's It. I like It. They're both pretty good. Even though they don't follow the book that much. But anyway, I think it's very similar in terms of that because think about all the movies he got made from his books and how they're most mainly not really good films in terms of their storyline. But in the book up it's basically amazing, right? I think it'll be very similar to this book, only because, if I gotta be honest, there's so much detail you have to think about when you read this book that I feel like if you miss out on a detail, it won't derail the story, but it will destroy part of a relationship that he either was trying to keep alive or he tried to let it die. Like there's one part of the story that I did not tell you a single thing about because it did nothing for the overall story, but it was important for his relationship in terms of who he was as a person. There's this girl named Dell who he used to date with Eddie. Like they all three of them like that. And then when Eddie died, Andrew never really looked Dell's way like at all. I never thought about like talking to her, and then she was the one who kept up appearance because she'd been broken up with them. She already understood that it wasn't about all three of them. It was about Andrew and Eddie, and they kind of just used her to like be the barrier of their entry. Because when I say they're basically lovers. They are basically lovers. It's kind of hard to imagine it in the same way as some of two people who are like, oh, we just love each other. It's more like, oh, their connection to the dead plus their connection with how they are with each other. I mean, it's also partly of them just not admitted to each other. Um, but I never told you about Dell, did I? Because I decided that wasn't part of the storyline. It wasn't part of the overall theme of the book. And he ended up just losing that relationship with her, even as a friendly one, because he never tried to like continue being friends with her. She would constantly be like, hey, you should see someone, you should talk to someone. And he would literally brush her off. But I'm a little interested by that because even though they don't keep her in a story for very long, because once she says goodbye to him, it meant forever. She was one of the people who actually believed that Eddie killed himself, and they never gave up an update to say, hey, she was wrong. But I guess when you destroy that relationship, you're not exactly looking forward to being like, oh, this one part that I was wrong about did affect my relationship with someone, but like in the grand scheme of things, it was already bad to begin with. Because essentially she was like the middle ground for Eddie and Andrew to basically hook up without it seeming like they were a label or something else. And they used her to be like, hey, let's be together. When in reality they just want to be together, but they don't want to be like basically homosexuals. They just wanted to be like in a threesome. But if Andrew was ever alone with Dell, Eddie gets mad. If Eddie was ever alone with Dell, Andrew will feel some type of way. So it's very much similar to heated rivalry, where they would never say how they were, but they definitely felt some type of way. And Shane definitely felt some type of way first. I mean, it's a lot more sex in that show, but the feelings are the same. I think it's very similar to the feelings. So it's a good book. I do like the book. I don't know how I felt about it because it was more of a storyline that talks to you more about how the Reverend was feeling, how it was affecting Andrew's relationship with like everything once Eddie died. And it was less about you realizing like, oh, he just going into depression of his best friend dying. It was more about him realizing like he wants to learn more about what Eddie was going through in these 6 months, while also simultaneously being like, I don't want to know anything he was doing in these 6 months because he lied to me. Because the entire storyline, Andrew is realizing he didn't tell me he met people. He didn't tell me he was doing spooky shit when he told me he wasn't gonna do that. He didn't tell me he was writing up all this stuff. Like he was telling Andrew a whole different story when they used to like call and text, only to find out that's all a lie. So it was very jarring for him to realize that. And I think if this was ever a movie, it should be a show because there's so much information I feel like they would lose out on if someone came in and said, "You, we're gonna make this a movie." I'm like, I don't want to know the premise. I don't want to think about who's going to change what because when you're very detailed like this book is, it's very detailed and to tell you how the referent gets into Andrew's body. How did Andrew feel when like something happened in like Eddie's bedroom, for example, when he felt the reverend trying to like move him away? I don't know, things like that. You lose that part of the story when you see it on TV, I feel like. With that being said, I gave it a 7 out of 10. I think it's hard to reconcile with the storyline very much so, which is why it took me so long. Because I would just sit there and be like, huh, what does that mean? Like, how did the Reverend kind of affect Andrew? Like, I was trying to think it through while reading because at some point I was really confused because they never called a Reverend a ghost. They never called it a curse until later. They never called it a poltergeist or a demon or possession. I mean, it was a possession, but they never like came out and said that. So I was trying to think about commonalities of other stories I've read where it's similar to this, and it was hard because I haven't read a horror film in a minute, and even the ones I have read have been very much not like this. So I think it's a really good book. It's called Summer Sons. The sons, I'm sure, are Andrew and Eddie. It is a sad book because Eddie is still dead, of course, right? And on top of that, even though Andrew knows the reason why he is dead, he also knows the truth about what caused his death and everything, even about the curse and everything. I think Eddie knew as well at the very end and did not save him at all, which is depressing because at the end of the day, you don't want to feel like you did everything for someone you loved, whether brother or otherwise, and then you just realize at the end of the day they're still gone, you know? So it's depressing in that way. But it's definitely a better read, I feel like, than A Good Marriage in some ways, just because it is more personal, it is more revealing, it's more vulnerable, even if Andrew doesn't like vulnerability, but he gets there, he does. So if you're looking for this book, you should pick it up. I don't know where you're gonna get it. I got it for free, per usual. And yeah, I give it a 7 out of 10. So thank you guys so much for watching my monthly book club. I'll see you guys again in a month when I pick out a different book. And it's March next month, so we'll see what we got going on. But remember to like, share, subscribe so you don't miss a new update from me on anything I might be doing. I don't know what I'm doing to next week, but I'll see you guys next time. Bye.